The rain had started before dawn, a steady cold drizzle that had soaked through the canopy of Wye Valley's deepest woodland, turning the narrow deer trails into slick, dark ribbons of mud, and by mid-morning, identical twins Amelia and Grace Carter, both 15, were picking their way over moss-slick roots with the black German Shepherd, Ranger, bounding ahead in bursts of excitement before stopping to sniff the air. The air was heavy with the smell of wet leaves and something faintly metallic, and the mist clung to the trees so thickly that every few steps the girls felt as though the forest were closing in behind them, swallowing their path, but they pressed on because Amelia was determined to find the old waterfall their late grandfather had told stories about, a hidden place he swore was haunted but which Grace believed was just a family myth. By the time they reached the slope that dipped towards the river, the drizzle had turned into a more insistent rain, pattering on their hoods and dripping from branches in slow, fat drops, and Ranger, who had been trotting happily, suddenly stopped dead, his hackles rising, his growl low and rumbling from his chest. The girls followed his gaze and saw, half hidden behind a mossy fallen oak, a man slumped awkwardly, his police uniform soaked and caked with mud, one leg bent at an unnatural angle, his side glistening dark red even in the grey light, and when Amelia knelt beside him, her fingers trembling, she read the name on his badge, Sergeant Callum Reeves, the very name they'd overheard their father mention a week ago when the news reported a police officer missing during an undercover operation against illegal poachers. Reeves' eyelids fluttered open, and his voice, hoarse and broken, rasped, "They're still out here. They'll finish me if they find me." Before he coughed, the wet sound of blood in his throat making Grace's stomach knot, Amelia's instincts kicked in from the first aid lessons their uncle, a former Royal Marine, had drilled into them. She yanked off her fleece, folded it, and pressed it hard against his side while Grace fumbled for her phone, only to find there was no signal this deep in the valley. The forest felt too still now, apart from the steady drum of rain, and then, in that stillness, came the faintest crunch of leaves. Ranger's growl deepened, and through the mist, they saw two figures in mottled camouflage, faces shadowed by hoods, moving slowly between the trees, one cradling what looked like a crossbow, the other with something long slung over his shoulder. The twins locked eyes and without speaking began dragging Reeves into the cover of the fallen oak, their boots slipping in the mud, their breathing harsh in their ears. They crouched there for minutes that felt like hours, listening as the men passed within 15 feet, muttering about finding the copper before he talks, and splitting up to search the ridge. Their voices fading but their footsteps snapping twigs somewhere to the east. Amelia whispered to Reeves to keep pressure on his side while she worked on his leg. The fracture was bad, bone pressing at the skin, so she tore her spare shirt into strips, tying a splint with sticks Ranger had dragged over when trained to fetch in emergencies. An hour crept by like molasses, every sound amplified. A squirrel darting across a branch made them flinch. A crow's call seemed like a signal. Once, they heard men shouting in the distance, followed by the faint crack of something metallic hitting wood, maybe an arrow. They stayed hidden until the rain eased and light began to thin through the canopy, signaling late afternoon, but their relief was short-lived when Reeves' breathing grew shallow and fast. He was going into shock. Grace remembered their uncle's voice. Shock kills faster than bleeding. Keep him warm. She unzipped her own coat, wrapping it around him, and sat close to share body heat, while Amelia checked her watch, calculating that if they didn't get him to help soon, he might not make it through the evening. In a gamble, Grace pulled out the emergency flare from her pack, but they knew firing it too soon might draw the wrong people. And then came the unmistakable sound of boots in mud again, closer this time. Ranger barked once, loud and deep, before Amelia clamped his muzzle. But the damage was done. A voice shouted, "Over here," and branches snapped as someone ran towards them. Amelia grabbed Reeves under the arms while Grace hefted his injured leg, and they stumbled away from the fallen tree, weaving between trunks until they reached a rocky outcrop near the river. There, hidden in a shallow cave barely big enough for the three of them and the dog, they crouched, dripping water, their breath misting in the cool air. For the next 2 hours they barely moved, listening to the men search, hearing their voices rise and fall. Hearing them curse the rain and complain about losing the trail. Once, a man stopped so close outside the cave that the girls could see mud dripping from his boots, but Ranger stayed utterly still, his muscles taut under Amelia's hand. As dusk fell, the forest changed. The damp air grew colder, the mist thickened into a pale, glowing wall, and the usual bird calls faded into eerie silence broken only by the drip of water and the occasional distant howl of a fox. Reeves began to mumble deliriously. His eyes rolling, Sir Amelia told him stories. Nonsense about their school, about Ranger chasing geese in the park. Anything to keep him talking. When full darkness came, the twins decided it was now or never. Grace loaded the flare, stepped out into the clearing, and fired it through the trees, the red glow casting the forest in an unearthly light. Within minutes, they heard shouts and running. Some were deeper voices they feared, but then came the pounding rotors of a helicopter and the answering calls of armed police. Beams of torchlight swept the trees, and in the chaos that followed, the smugglers were caught in a pincer movement, 2 tackled near the ridge, another dragged out from the undergrowth where he'd been hiding. Reeves was lifted onto a stretcher, his muddied hand gripping Amelia's so tight she thought her fingers would bruise, and he whispered, 10 hours. You kept me alive 10 hours, before being carried towards the waiting helicopter. When the twins emerged from the forest, pale, soaked, and caked in mud, the chief superintendent was there in person, telling them their actions had not only saved Reeves but helped dismantle the largest wildlife smuggling ring in the country. And though the commendation ceremony weeks later brought applause, medals, and official words of praise, it was the private moment afterwards, when Reeves, now walking with a cane, hugged them and bent to scratch Ranger behind the ears, that made Amelia and Grace realize they'd just lived through something they would carry in their bones forever. A long, cold, dangerous day in the wild heart of England that would become the kind of story whispered by police and rangers for decades to come.